I am very pleased to read for you a delightful story by the fiction writer Maxwell Conroe. Titled The Dupin Files, Sherlock Holmes, this story is one out of 25 new adventures collected in Magic Musings, Conroe's latest story bundle. 1. Personal Introductions. My name is Auguste Dupin, and I honed my skills ever since I was created by Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, 1809 to 1849, who introduced the English-speaking part of the world to modern ways of detecting clues as to who committed crimes and murders. I am the master detective in the most famous Poe stories that have served as templates for later writers of the detective genre, of which Conan Doyle, 1859 to 1930, and Agatha Christie, 1890 to 1976, were the late 19th and 20th century giants. Ironically, I now have been retained by the two main characters of these writers, Mr. Hercule Poirot and Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to gather evidence for their claims against the estates of their creators. In a separate article, I have already deposited the principal evidence regarding the case of Poirot versus Christie. Here I will give a brief outline of my findings regarding the case of Holmes versus Doyle. Beyond doubt, Doyle was a very ambitious writer. Not unlike Christie, he had a vast literary output. He gave away his ambition via one of his characters, Cyprian Overbeck Wells, in a literary mosaic, page 200 to 219 in Volume 1 of the collected Supernatural and Were Fiction of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I determined to devote my leisure to running rapidly through the works of leading English novelists, from Daniel Defoe to the present day, in the hope of emulating my latent ideas and getting a good grasp of the general tendency of literature. I had just completed the task of reading through the majority of the standard novels at the time when my narrative commences. Doyle, in addition to his home stories, also authored a series of 17 historical short stories, and a play and a novel, starring Colonel Etienne Gerard, a hussar in the French army of Emperor Napoleon. The Gerard stories were serialized in The Strand, a literary magazine, and later published in 2 booklets by the same publisher. Doyle also wrote Verne-style science fiction adventure stories, with a main role attributed to protagonist Professor Challenger. Doyle was press-savvy and conceived the idea to pose himself as his Professor Challenger character. In 1912, with fake beard, his pictures were featured in The Strand, to great acclaim. Doyle with his Challenger impersonation sold stories and books, making The Strand a famous and successful magazine. While Doyle earned splendid sums, he could comfortably live off his writings. Meanwhile, the ambivalent attitude of Doyle towards Holmes' character led the author to frequently make derogatory statements about the sleuth. Doyle frequently put words in the mouth of Hastings, portraying his longtime friend as a drug addict. Further ad hominem attacks by Doyle alluded to Holmes' apparent ignorance of certain well-known scientific facts. Doyle repeatedly threatened to kill Holmes, and actually did so in a final episode. The period of abuse and suffering under uncertainty lasted about 40 years. Of course, Holmes himself had no say in how Doyle was molding him during his literary career, at the expense of Holmes and with recurrent episodes of retirement, assassination, resurrection and disappearances, as we shall see. 2. Pedigree Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was the key character in 60 original detective stories. He was first conceived in 1887 by his creator, Arthur Conan Doyle, who would kill and revive Holmes as he pleased, in various periods, finally killed Sherlock's character for a last time in the final episode written and published by him in 1927. But Holmes would first be featured in numerous very successful story bundles, with each exactly 12 stories, that appeared serialized in the magazine The Strand from July 1881 to June 1882. Then in 1882, the first stories were bundled in book form as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The hugely successful serial was briskly abandoned by Doyle for over a decade, but then he reanimated Sherlock Holmes to feature in the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, the stories of which were also initially serialized in The Strand of 1894, before being bundled into book form. Although Doyle had made it appear as if Holmes had been killed in the final episode of the 1894 memoirs, he would revive Holmes, but not until another decade later, in 1905, now with 13 stories serialized in the Strand, which next were bundled as The Return of Sherlock Holmes, 1905. A fourth series of 7 short Holmes stories was published in the Strand between 1908 and 1913, and bundled in His Last Bow, first published in 1917. In the 1917 stories for His Last Bow, Holmes was brought out of retirement for more pre-war counter-espionage work. In fact, His Last Bow was truly a wartime volume, subtitled The War Service of Sherlock Holmes. Unlike what His Last Bow suggested, Holmes would not be laid to rest. 12 more Holmes stories were written by Doyle over the last decade of his life, and bundled in a fifth and final bundle of Holmes stories in the Case Book of Sherlock Holmes, published in 1927. In addition to starring in the 56 short stories, collected in the 5 bundles mentioned above, Holmes also was the main character in 4 standalone novels: A Study in Scarlet, 1887, The Sign of 4, 1889, The Hound of the Baskervilles, 1902, and The Valley of Fear, 1915. In summary, exactly 60 crime stories were played out by Holmes, with the 60th story being The Adventures of the Cardboard Box, which was in the original British bundle of His Last Bow, suppressed for its themes of domestic violence and marital infidelity. However, the story was included in the 1917 U.S. version of His Last Bow. The publication of the Holmes stories spanned 40 years of intermittent active service for Arthur Conan Doyle. The author passed in 1930, but the fame of Holmes did not fade, because the collection of 60 original stories appears a magnet for producers of television series and even full-blown movies, released worldwide in multiple castings and countless adaptations, including stage plays and radio plays as well. Holmes, now well over 150 years old, continues to inspire art directors, playwrights, and the general public. It is by all means obvious, Holmes' last word has not yet been spoken. We are about to hear more of him. But he seeks justice, which is why I, Auguste Dupin, have compiled this file.